Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Teaser in 20 Exploring Empathy. This is Mark Valenti. Our teasers are 20 minutes long at the most, and they're not intended to make you an expert. Really, it's about giving you some bite-sized bits of information for you to decide is it something you want to include with the rest of the information you have in your brain, and really something you decide you want to eat up. Or you could listen to what I'm saying and decide, meh, I don't want it, I'm spitting it out. Either way, you only remember about 20% of what you're told, so feel free to rewind, listen to this again, or take some notes. There are oftentimes documents that accompany these presentations, so if you don't have it, let me know and I can send it to you. The idea behind the teasers is that although we'd like to think we live in a perfect world, our world is very far from perfect. Processes are broken, systems break down, people don't always do the things that we expect them to do. Emotions, forgetfulness, all those things really influence human behavior. And lest we get depressed about it, we actually embrace this and say, what can we learn about human behavior? What can we learn about the ways we communicate and how can we get better? That's why I pulled together a lot of different information from business, healthcare, psychology, and try to present it in a way that makes sense but is simplified. And again, it's just meant to give you a bite-sized bit of information. If you decide that you would like more information, let me know. I also do workshops that are longer than the 20 minutes. This is just meant to give you a tease, which is why it's the teaser in 20. All the discussions are around the framework of behavior change occurring when three elements are present: knowledge, importance, and confidence. So when you think about behavior change, does the person have the knowledge of the change? Do they even find the change important? And finally, are they confident in making the change? The sessions are rated PG-13 because we have a lot of pop culture references to the news. So you may hear some rude humor, mild language that may not be appropriate if you're under 13. So with that, let's talk about today's teaser, Exploring Empathy. So empathy is quite the buzzword, but what does it mean? Do you have it? Can you even get it if you don't? And as I start this, you may ask yourself, how is he going to incorporate coronavirus into this teaser? Well, that is a fantastic question. So as we're talking about coronavirus, let's briefly talk about how it's changed the world. Our interactions have changed with each other. In some cases, our motivation has changed as we operate out of lower emotions, including fear, which causes us to act differently. So I'm going to talk about a few situations, and I want you to think about how you're feeling when you're viewing or thinking about these situations. Now, the first situation is a story that happened in Philadelphia as police removed a man from a public bus for not wearing a mask. Here's a brief 50-second clip. So how did you feel? How did you feel about the way the gentleman is treated? How did you feel about the way that he was causing issues? Who did you connect with? What are your emotions? The next slide, I want you to think about your reaction when you go to the store. When you're wearing a mask, how do you feel when you see somebody not wearing one? If you don't wear a mask, how do you feel when people are wearing them all around you? What is your reaction? What do your emotions tell you? Speaking of the stores, there are some governors who have made a restriction that certain aisles of non-essential items are blocked off in Walmart and Target. How do you feel about the governors who make that restriction? How do you feel about the people protesting these restrictions? What do your emotions tell you? The next story is from Greenville, Mississippi, where police raided a parking lot of Temple Baptist Church during a drive-in prayer service, and they issued $500 fines to the parishioners. The pastor said, one of the police officers said the mayor wanted to make an example of our church. I told them to get some tickets ready because we will be here preaching Sunday morning and Sunday night. How do you feel about the pastor? Do you feel he's a hero or a troublemaker? Finally, thinking about Dr. Anthony Fauci, who said recently, the only path for sports to return this summer includes no fans in attendance and players being kept in quarantine for the duration of their seasons. He said, There's a way of doing that. He said, nobody comes to the stadium. Put the players in big hotels, wherever you want to play. Keep them really well surveilled. Have them tested every single week and make sure they don't wind up infecting each other or their family. How do you feel about Dr. Fauci? Is he a hero or is he a totalitarian? So what are your feelings? Your feelings are your own. They are there because of years, decades of experiences. Your ability to put aside your own feelings, your own worldview, and relate to others and understand their perspective is called empathy. Empathy is the experience of another person's thoughts and feelings from their point of view rather from your own point of view. And it's different from sympathy when you feel for the person. It's not relating to someone's story because you've been there. It's relating to it and understanding it because it's their story. You know, we often talk about the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But instead of the golden rule, let's focus on the platinum rule, which is do unto others as they would want done to them. So instead of putting your values on somebody else, think about what might the other person want. Empathy is also a crucial part of motivational interviewing, which is helping people change. It's one of the 4 components. And empathy and the ability to express empathy is conveying understanding or making an effort to grasp an individual's perspective and experience. A provider who is proficient in motivational interviewing, expressing empathy, shows evidence of deep understanding of the patient's point of view, not just for what has been explicitly stated, but what the patient means but not yet said. So you see, it's a very powerful tool. We also make references to Dan Pink's drive, and empathy is an important component for somebody realizing their own intrinsic motivation, which is doing something for the purpose larger than themselves or trying to get better. But they can't get to intrinsic motivation unless their lower level motivators are met, their lower level needs. There are actually 3 different types of empathy. The first one is cognitive empathy. And cognitive empathy is really thinking about where you sense how the other person thinks about the world. It's an ability to understand another person's perspective. And that always isn't easy, especially if you disagree with people. Cognitive empathy really asks that you acknowledge the possibility that another person acts and feels the way they do for reasons that are rational to them. It doesn't matter if they're rational to you or not. In doing so, though, you give yourself some breathing room. So again, it doesn't matter if you agree with the other person. It just lets you consider through cognitive empathy that there are perspectives that are beyond yours, and there's a reason why they do that, even if what they do doesn't make sense on the surface. The second type of empathy is emotional empathy. And emotional empathy is the ability to feel how another person feels, and it's a higher level of empathy. Psychology researchers Hodges and Myers describe emotional empathy as feeling the same emotion as the other person, feeling our own distress in response to their pain, or feeling compassion toward the other person. And it takes a while to get to that point. So it may be too much to approach in the beginning as you're just learning empathy or honing your empathy skills. So in order to reach emotional empathy, we must first aim for that cognitive empathy because it's easier. The third kind of empathy is called empathic concern. And empathic concern is the ability to sense what the other person needs from you. Lots of people think they can sense others' needs. For instance, they may think that the other person needs a hug, but they're often wrong about that. And most of the time when we say that, we're putting our own values on someone else because we say, you look like you need a hug, even if the person truly doesn't. People that have honed the skill of empathic concern truly know that the other person needs a hug and they're able to meet their needs. So the 3 kinds of empathy, cognitive, emotional, and empathic concern, are just ways we start breaking that down, and cognitive focusing on the thinking and behind it versus emotional and empathic concern, which is really, really tuned into the other person's emotions. So those are 3 types of empathy. So the question is it genetic or learned? Is it the typical nature versus nurture? So let's talk about nature and why we may have it in our genes. Going back thousands of years, in those harsh environments, it actually became necessary for people to cooperate with each other to keep babies alive and the families to take care of their offspring. As people came together as communities, it means that we had to bond together to be aware of outside influences, outside threats such as animals and other tribes. Our brains actually evolved and grew to express empathy as a way of surviving. And it carries over onto the modern society as well, as relationships are the reasons we evolved the way we did and the way we interact today. And over time, our brains evolved to express this. These are scientific, objective measurements of empathy. So, for example, if the following picture makes you feel uncomfortable, then you feel empathic pain. The sensation activates the same brain regions as real pain. It's what we call the wince test. However, we don't always feel other people's pain as fully as they do. Otherwise, we'd be drained all the time. In fact, our brains have what they call the right supramarginal gyrus that helps us separate our emotions from others. It helps us understand others without becoming them. It also, unfortunately, leads humans to be self-centered depending on their level of empathy. They project their feelings onto others, which is called the righting reflex. There was actually a study that was done last year that demonstrated that, and here's a 55-second clip on why some people may express less empathy than others.
Money can't buy you class. If you drive an expensive car, you're probably a jerk on the road. Take it from a new study out of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Flashy drivers are less likely to stop and let folks cross the street. Researchers did the math after filming volunteers cross the road hundreds of times. It played out like this. The likelihood of them slowing down decreased by 3% for every extra $1,000 that their vehicle is worth. Why aren't they pumping the brakes? Researchers think these car owners feel a sense of superiority over other folks sharing the road, including people crossing the street. They also said expensive car owners probably can't relate to people who aren't in their shoes because their sense of entitlement gets in the way. This leads to a lack of empathy for pedestrians and flashy car owners driving selfishly. The new results are in line with a Finnish study from last month. Researchers found men who drove flashy vehicles were more likely to be argumentative, unempathetic, and stubborn.
So we see that people have different levels of empathy. Empathy is part of our nature, as we talked about, and not just learn. We have the basics, but it takes work to make us proficient. Our ability to improve our empathy also goes back to childhood, like everything else, in the way that we were nurtured. And we find that, not surprisingly, children that were shown empathy develop a greater sense of empathy with those around them. And those that actually were not shown empathy end up showing less empathy as adults. And in some extreme cases, individuals are said to suffer from sociopathy. So how does this all relate to the workplace, whether it's in the office or working from your home? How can you lead with empathy? Author Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ, talks about empathy deficit disorder. He talks about that effective leaders are outstanding at abilities that build on empathy, like persuasion, motivating, listening, but those that suffer from this deficit disorder can best be detected by how they impact the people around them in a negative way. So there's a couple signs that he talked about that somebody may be suffering from EDD. The first one is when leaders send out directives or memos or different expectations that make no sense to the people receiving them. It could be a sign that the boss does not understand how employees think about their world. This could apply to strategies, plans, or goals that really seem off point to the people that are supposed to execute them. Another sign of EDD are leaders who send out directives or commands that upset those receiving them. And it seems that the boss doesn't accurately read the emotional reality of the employees and seems clueless and unempathetic to those receiving them. Another symptom of EDD are leaders that express attitudes that seem out of touch with the issues employees struggle with. It shows a lack of concern. Unfortunately, as a result, it puts employees on the defensive and they're afraid to take risks like innovating. They're no longer in the higher level of intrinsic motivation. And leaders at higher levels are most in danger of coming down with empathy deficit disorder when they rise through the ranks and people are afraid to give them feedback, and thus they're even more separated from reality. So the question is, what can you do? How can you build your empathy? You certainly can't fake your empathy, but you can increase your connection to other people through some steps. And it all has to do with your emotional intelligence and your ability to be self-aware, but also aware of the people around you, and really being able to look in the mirror. So the first step of increasing your empathy is awareness. Be aware of how other people respond to you. Pay attention to how others are reacting, what they're communicating to you. Putting in the extra effort to really listen and observe can really teach you a lot about human interactions and emotions. The second step is to put empathy in action. Get involved with helping people in some way, like volunteering. The closer you get to a situation, the more you'll realize people have a lot of their own difficulties and struggles. Or maybe shadowing in the workplace. Some departments have a program where you can actually switch roles for a day just to really get a sense of what somebody else does. It's really about putting your empathy into action. The third thing is focus on others. Put aside your own preoccupations. Put aside your own values and judgment for a moment and ask yourself how you would feel in another situation. There's always several perspectives. Try to look at the situation in 2 or 3 different ways. The fourth way, practice curiosity. Part of showing empathy is being interested in other people. Ask random people some questions about themselves. Show an interest. In healthcare, there's a focus on the clinical side of things, very cold testing, pathophysiology. We really focus on the health experience or an individual's own perspective. Practicing curiosity helps us better understand an individual and what they're going through. So I like to practice a framework called FIFE. FIFE stands for feelings, ideas, functioning, and expectations. So really trying to understand another person's feelings about their diabetes, trying to understand their ideas about what may be causing the shortness of breath, what might be causing their trip to the hospital, trying to understand a person's functioning and how their day-to-day life is impacted by their COPD or their asthma or their drinking. And finally, expectations. What does the other person expect from their healthcare experience? What do they expect from you? So really focusing on FIFE as a framework is a way to really focus on those curious questions to understand the other person. The fifth way to increase your empathy is to avoid labeling and stamping with a one-size-fits-all descriptor. We're always trying to figure things out as human beings, and we attribute certain things to people and we label them. So not all BMW drivers are jerks. Not all bureaucrats are incompetent, but we try to label them to make sense of the world. And as a result, we're less forgiving than many situations call for. Instead, try to understand each person is an individual and that others have pressure and stress and it leads them to do the things they do. So the things you could do: awareness of how other people are reacting to you, action, putting empathy to action, maybe going out and volunteering, experiencing other people's jobs, focus on somebody else and what their experiences are and putting aside your own judgment for a moment, curiosity, asking curious questions and trying to understand someone's experience and using FIFE as a framework for that. And individualization. Instead of labeling somebody as part of a group, a generation, a job, try to understand them as an individual. A few other things can help with empathy. Meditation has been shown to help cultivate brain states that increase empathy. Also, compassion training has been shown to connect brain regions involved in emotion regulation and positive emotions. And believe it or not, reading fiction may actually boost empathy because you're putting yourself in the character's shoes as you're reading it. If you're interested, Psychology Today has a lot of self-assessments, including one to see if you're an empath. There's 20 questions, self-assessment to give you some more ideas about where you may fall on that scale. The one thing I want to say in closing is that be aware that you have your own battery. And if you practice too much empathy, if you're too connected to everyone else's experiences, you won't have any batteries left. You will have no energy for yourself or others, and your battery's drained. So try to find ways to combat this compassion fatigue, because it could be detrimental to your well-being and your ability to make rational decisions. In fact, there's a lot of studies that show that increased compassion fatigue can actually cause anxiety disorders. So in the end, to be empathic toward others, make sure that you're taking care of yourself first. This has been the Teaser in 20. I am Mark Valenti, and thank you so much for listening.